Hello, BookTube. I have a starter kit for you today, a much requested starter kit that I'm finally getting around to, and it's World War II. Those of you who've been watching this channel for any length of time will know that I am incredibly fascinated by World War II. I think it is one of the grandest subjects that's ever happened. Grander by far than any war, and grander by far also than any mythological account of a war. It's just an incredible saga in terms of great heroism, unprecedented events, great evil, heartbreaking compromises, heartbreaking victories. So I thought we would go over it in a starter kit. And as with most starter kits, I'm faced with two paradigms here. On the one hand, I want to do the kind of starter kit that says, okay, if you don't have all the time in the world to read, then here's the one book on these subjects that you should read if you don't read anything else. That's one part. That's one kind of a starter kit. Another kind of a starter kit is, here's the first book that you should read on the subject. And I have to admit, this starter kit is kind of a blur between those two. I really couldn't decide in a lot of cases. There have been hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books written about every aspect of World War II. For the convenience of a starter kit, I have limited this to 10 such aspects, but I could easily have done 20, 30, 50, and for each one of those 50 aspects, I could have listed many, many books. I left a lot of them out, and a lot of these are incredibly general. I myself happen to think that they are really good, big signposts for you to get a handle on the subject. So we're going to leave out everything before the war, like for instance the many, many books that have been written on the rise of Hitler and Nazism. There are a great many of those books that are fantastic and illuminating. We're going to leave those out. We're going to start, category number 1 will be Munich, 1938. Neville Chamberlain flying to Germany over and over again in order to try what he saw as a desperate last-ditch effort to avoid World War II entirely. He and his entire generation remembered vividly, traumatically, World War I. In their imaginations, in the time since, it had grown into a thing that was worth any price to avoid. And Chamberlain was willing to pay almost any price to avoid it, including sacrificing lesser countries to Hitler's ambition. It was only in the wake of Munich, it was only in the wake of those agreements and their abandonment by Nazi Germany that Chamberlain and the rest of the world, aside from the few diehard anti-Nazis who already knew it, realized that there wasn't any limit to Hitler's ambition, that there wasn't any limit to his hunger, and that there wasn't any limit to his duplicity. So he wasn't someone you could not deal with. In other words, horrible as it was, especially for Chamberlain's generation to realize, there was no alternative but war. You can take a lot of different stances on the whole, not just the meetings, but the whole drama of Munich, the whole drama of alleged appeasement. There are a whole bunch of opinions to take on that subject, and a whole bunch of opinions to take on Neville Chamberlain. But I have one book that I want to recommend as a start. And unlike like a lot of books on this list, it's a chunker. There's no way to avoid that. It's Munich, The Price of Peace by Telford Taylor, who was there and who actively participated, and then who went home and thought about it, gathered as many memoirs and many records as he could, had access to a lot of stuff because of his participation that hasn't really been duplicated, and wrote a great book, a great big whopping book in I think the late 1970s, called Munich, The Price of Peace. I don't know if Munich, The Price of Peace is still in print. There are a number of books on Munich that are in print that are fairly new. There's one coming out. There's one that hasn't come out yet, but there's also a famous one from I think a year ago, 2 years ago. You'll see those, and they are much thinner than Telford Taylor's book, and if that's where you want to start, that's fine. Keep in mind, my approach to most of the subjects like this would be the very first place you should start is to pay close attention to the Wikipedia article. Just read the Wikipedia article so that you get a good overview. But in addition to that, if you want to read one of these more recent, shorter ones, that's fine. But in my opinion, the one to do, again, that aspect of a starter kit, the one to do, if you're only doing one, is Telford Taylor's book. Just find a used copy. Then number 2 is the Battle of Britain, and Britain standing alone. Britain and its empire standing alone, because that did happen. Of course, Munich failed, and war was declared, and France was knocked out of the fight fairly quickly, and occupied. Half the country was occupied, and that left, for a dizzy moment, that left Britain alone against an industrial European superpower that had already conquered a long list of countries. And that is an amazing story. Britain alone, and the Battle of Britain, the air war over Britain, the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, it's an incredible story of heroism. It reads better than a novel on the subject could. So I wanted to recommend, there are, again, a slew of books on this and every other signpost of the war, but I want to recommend The Battle of Britain, Myth and Reality by Richard Overy, who looks at the Battle of Britain was immediately mythologized. Even while it was taking place, it was being mythologized, and it has continued to be so in Hollywood movies ever since. And Overy's book is really good at cutting through the mythology. I know from memory and also from experience dealing with younger people that nothing can be more dispiriting than trying to make your way into a historical subject and realizing that you are dealing with a lot of mythology, because you don't know where to put your feet, and that's not a good feeling. That's another use for Wikipedia. Wikipedia is self-correcting. It wasn't in the beginning. In its beginning years, it richly deserved the mockery that it got on sites like The Onion. But now, World War II specialists go in there regularly to make sure their subject, their micro-subject, is accurately represented. And their competitors and the people who disagree with them go in and do likewise. And everyone has to have sources. And it's all overseen. It's an amazing thing. So using that as a guide to cut through mythology is a very good idea, a good way to start. It's a little untrustworthy because sometimes the loudest kettle among those, that cohort of revolving editors, it sounds the loudest, and so you are still left with a little bit of a bias. So that may be to start, but Richard Overy's book is great as a book to hold in your hand that isn't changing from moment to moment. And then signpost number 3, once we get to signpost number 3, World War II takes on its World War characteristics. Not only the size of it, but also the cascade of insane decisions. World War II, because it was largely prosecuted by a maniac, is characterized by a cascade of insane decisions. And they start with signpost number 3, which is Pearl Harbor. Not Pearl Harbor itself, because the United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt had cut off the oil supplies to the Empire of Japan. That was a death sentence. That was an act of war. It wasn't called so, was never declared that way, but believe it. The Empire of Japan knew that it was an act of war, and knew also that it was a death sentence. And in retaliation for that, and as a way, an insane decision on its own. It was an insane decision. I'm sure that they probably thought they had no choice. They attacked, a sneak attack, on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and crippled a large number of the planes that were there, and almost took the United States out of the fight in the Pacific. Almost. There were key fuel dumps that weren't touched. There were aircraft carriers that weren't touched. The United States' ability to respond militarily was not removed. And although I would consider Pearl Harbor to be a success in the short run, it was a disastrous long-term failure, because it guaranteed an outcome that an oil embargo does not. It guaranteed your complete destruction in war. And it was part of a much wider thing where the Empire of Japan attacked many targets in the Pacific. But in terms of a turning point in the war, Pearl Harbor has to be studied alone. And the book I want to recommend is old. Like a lot of the books that I'm recommending here, it's old, but it is still really, really good. In my opinion, the best. And that's At Dawn We Slept by Gordon Prange. I think that it's still in print. I'm pretty sure that Penguin still prints it. But every library in the world will have a copy. Every used bookstore in the world will have a copy. You can certainly find a copy. It's comprehensive, it's thrilling, and it's a lot meatier than a lot of the other good one-volume accounts that I could recommend. So I'm going to recommend At Dawn We Slept, and I will, if I remember, I will write down all these choices down below. There are plenty of other choices for Pearl Harbor. But Pearl Harbor begins, like I said, a cascade of irrational choices, not just because I think if you take a big step back and you are the war makers in the Empire of Japan, you would, in hindsight, say, okay, this was a bad idea. There were people, Japanese commanders, Japanese lawmakers at the time, who thought it was a bad idea. But I think everybody would have if you'd taken a step back and realized that any other alternative you would have used would have been better. That makes it irrational on its own. And a thing that followed, an enormous irrationality that followed from that enormous irrationality, is that in response to the United States declaring war on the Empire of Japan, in response to Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. I don't know. I have never read a convincing explanation of why. I don't think there is one. I think the explanation is that he was insane. But one way or another, Pearl Harbor is the thing that did that. So Pearl Harbor is the thing you have to read about. And then signpost number 4 is also likewise springs from a totally irrational decision on Adolf Hitler's part, which was to invade Russia. He decided to invade Russia. And he thought, to the extent that thinking was involved, he thought, I have perfected the art of blitzkrieg warfare. I have perfected the art of knocking countries down for the count in weeks instead of months. And if I do that to the Soviet Union, then A, I have a huge amount of territory to dispose of for my troops and also for my slaves. And B, I have vast amounts of oil, vast reserves, oil fields that I badly, badly need. That's insane thinking. That's absolutely insane thinking. Not those long-term logistical goals. Those make perfect sense. The idea that you can knock out the Soviet Union in a couple of weeks is insane thinking. Hitler was absolutely counting on the fact that he could be in Stalingrad before winter set in. He was insane, but he was at least sane enough to remember that there was no way he could possibly win if he was fighting in Russia in winter. And that's exactly what happened. And the Eastern Front, of course, is enormous. It's understudied in the West in schools. Most Western students, when they learn about World War II, learn only about the Western Front. They never even learn how many people died on the Eastern Front, and they never even hear an argument for something that I think a case can be made, that the war was lost to Germany in the Eastern Front. One way or another, recently there's been a spate of great books, but even so, I want to recommend an older one. I want to recommend 2 books. The older one I want to recommend is very old. It's 50 years old, and it's Russia at War by Alexander Werth, which I think does a fantastic narrative job, even though there are some key sources that it doesn't use, that it doesn't have access to. And then later than that, a little bit later than that, is another great book. It's by Norman Stone, who is unbelievably readable, and it's called The Eastern Front. And these are 2 big whopper books. Pretty sure that both of them would still be in print. If the Eastern Front interests you, then those are the overviews to use. Now, keep in mind, the Eastern Front is the same as the rest of these signposts, the same as the rest of every part of World War II, in that there are a million other things that I could recommend. There have been at least 12 really good, first-rate English language histories simply of the Siege of Stalingrad. And I would recommend quite a few of them. They're all very good. But you know my approach to these starter kits and to studying history just in general is get an overview in order to determine first what you want to study in detail. There's no way you're going to know that unless you have a broad overview first, and then the way to get confident, the way to get so that these things fascinate you as they come along, these new books, is to pick a subject. Now, if Stalingrad is your subject, first you have to set it in its context. So I would recommend these books to do that, and then move on from there. And then signpost number 5 is another part of the war that, again, tends to get second billing to the Western Front, and that is the Pacific War. World War II was, in enormous part, a naval war. And the whole time that war was raging on the east and that war was raging on the Western Front, there was an enormous war being fought between the United States and the Empire of Japan in the Pacific Ocean. It's a vast subject. It's a thoroughly naval subject. It has attracted some fantastic writers, some fantastic books. And I want to recommend, again, two for this. I'm cheating just a little because I'm not... some of these I couldn't narrow it down to just one book. So, again, I want to recommend something old and something new. The old book is John Costello's book, The Pacific War. A classic, buttoned-down... from the experts, one-volume history of the war in the Pacific. And then the later one is not just about the war in the Pacific, but it's still tremendously good on that subject. It's by Craig Symonds, and it's called World War II at Sea. And it came out, I think, just last year, so it will still be readily available. I don't think it's had a paperback yet in the United States, but we'll see it on this channel when it does. I strongly recommend both. Then, of course, we're making our way to D-Day, but first... there's another subject. It's a World War II subject. It's not military, but it is crucial. It defines the war. And it also has had 1 million books written about it, just 1 million books. And that is, of course, the Holocaust, which could actually be categorized under that cascade of irrationalities, because Hitler's hatred for the Jews was so intense, so monomaniacal, that it was his focus, even when his focus should have been military. It still was a very high on the list of, if not at the top of, his priorities. And that is really insane. In addition to being monstrous, it's also insane to be diverting rail cars and troops and supplies and coal for the job of genocide while you're losing battles on the Western and Eastern Front. But nevertheless, the Holocaust is a subject that, if you're going to read, it has to be in a World War II starter kit. And narrowing down the books was hard. I again brought it down to two. The first one is fairly new in paperback. It's Peter Longerich. He did the book simply called The Holocaust. And it's not as long a one-volume treatment as quite a few other books on the subject, but I think it's tremendously good. Just tremendously thoroughly researched. And the second book I want to recommend on the subject is Unconventional. It's by Timothy Snyder, and it's called Black Earth, and it is like no other Holocaust book that you will ever have read. Eye-opening. Timothy Snyder is, when he does these things, he did another book called Bloodlands that I cannot recommend strongly enough. But his book Black Earth is likewise just unbeholden to any narrative traditions on the subject. He comes at it completely fresh, which you wouldn't think would be possible on a subject as much treated as the Holocaust, but he does it. So now we're going to move on to signpost number 7, which is D-Day. After long preparation, after months and months of trial and error, after months and months of seeding the ground with false campaigns and also softening the ground with all sorts of clandestine paratrooper drops, the Allies were finally ready to assault Europe. The decision taken at the highest levels of Allied command was that Hitler should come first. Regardless of anything else that was going on in the world, the defeat of Nazi Germany should come first. And so a vast amount of resources, thousands of vessels, thousands of men were poured towards this endeavor, towards actually making a beachhead on the continent of Europe. And it's an amazing story of heroism and desperation and logistical triumph and logistical insanity. And again, there have been a slew of books, quite a few of them coming out this year for the 75th anniversary. And one of the ones that I want to recommend is one of those. It's by Peter Caddick-Adams. We've seen it on this channel, and it's Sand and Steel. I have read many books on D-Day, and it is terrific. It's a big, hefty thing. But boy, oh boy, do you have the whole subject in your hand when you read it. And another book on the subject is one that also has come up on this channel because it just recently got a reprint in the Library of America. And it's a much older book. It was a classic of its generation. It was the Sand and Steel of its generation. And it's The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan. They're both terrifically readable. They're very different reading experiences. If I had to recommend one, it would be Sand and Steel, but I recommend both of them, and I will list all these down below. Then Germany was out of fuel, and it was out of men, and it was being converged upon by two extremely powerful forces from the West and the East. Its commercial strength was almost gone. Its agricultural strength was almost gone. Its personnel was almost gone. It was going to lose. Germany was going to lose. From the minute the Allies made a successful landing in the West, the war was over. In fact, there were many high-ranking Nazi officials who thought the war was over long before that. And what followed was, if we concentrate on the Western Front, or even the Eastern Front, what followed was the rolling up of the Nazi operation. And the next signpost that I want to do is the last dramatic incident of that rolling up, the Battle of the Ardennes Forest, the battle that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, where Germany was shrinking, it was pulling in, it was being forced in on all sides, and Hitler decided, again, one last cascade of insanity, he decided to try to break out to a nearby big river and then maybe to open water. What he thought was going to happen, I have no idea. Once again, I do not think that thought had much to do with this. But the Battle of the Bulge caught the Allies by surprise. They, even after what they'd seen, that winter they were fairly certain that they could expect rational decisions from this point out, and that there wouldn't be a concerted German attack, that Germany knew it was beat. That was the phrase that was used endlessly at the time. Germany knows it's beat. And so the German forces, they prepared in secret, they advanced in secret, and they were able to walk right up to Allied defenses, and a lot of times walk right past them. So the initial scramble, the initial 24 hours of the Battle of the Bulge were a desperate affair, just desperate. Makes for very heroic reading, makes for very exciting reading, and it's a signpost because it's the last desperate gasp of Germany to be on the offensive. It is, in its way, Gettysburg. And for the Battle of the Bulge, again, I want to cheat and mention, too, the classic account is by Charles MacDonald, called A Time for Trumpets. Again, he was a participant. Again, he was directly involved. Again, he was the generation treating World War II as not just a massive historical event, but a living historical event. And we are going to see that change. Those accounts, like Cornelius Ryan's or Gordon Prange's, those accounts are going to start belonging to a different era as we start to see these things treated more completely as historical events. So I want to recommend Charles MacDonald's book for that, but I also want to recommend Peter Caddick-Adams again, because his previous book, Snow and Steel, was about the Battle of the Bulge and is amazing. Just every bit as good as Sand and Steel. I want to make sure to recommend those two. And the whole time that this was going on, that the mopping up, the rolling up, the squeezing of Nazi Germany was taking place on the Western Front, the war in the Pacific was grinding on, island by island, readout by readout, in some of the most horrific fighting stories that you will ever read. And the Allies, America in this case, was faced with a prospect. They were faced with the prospect of this going on for another year or two. They were faced with the prospect of Japanese forces suicidally defending every last inch of ground all the way to the home islands. And of course, that you might say, well, yeah, that's the prospect, that's war, unless maybe internal forces in Japan win the day and they sue for peace. That is what you can expect. You can expect that they will fight for every last inch of ground. That's what Germany did. But the Allies in this case had an alternative they'd been working on in secret, and they decided to use it. Just so I'm not screaming at you, okay, and not any more than I have to be. They decided to use this alternative in war. It was an unthinkable alternative. It was an unconscionable thing to do. It was President Truman who did it, not President Roosevelt, who had died by here. And Roosevelt never got to see the end of the war that he led. And that was, of course, to use nuclear bombs in warfare. Not on a fleet at sea, but on a city. These things had been tested in the desert. They had been examined in laboratories. The people who made this decision knew perfectly well what the result would be. They didn't know it to the last detail, but they knew what a horrifying thing it was that they were doing, and they did it anyway, not once, but twice, and would have kept doing it, city by city, in Japan, if Japan had not surrendered. So the next signpost to study is Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the two unfortunate cities that were laid waste by atomic bombs. Thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians instantly vaporized, burned beyond recognition, radiation poisoned, deformed, in stories that even now, all this time later, just chill the blood. And I have two recommendations that I want to make on this subject. One, of course, is Hiroshima by John Hersey, an American writer who wrote a long nonfiction account, a nonfiction novella, basically, following a handful of people in Hiroshima when the bomb dropped, and what they went through, hour by hour, minute by minute. It has never been out of print. It's a tremendous bestseller. It changed the world's mind frame, and I believe is the thing that is single-handedly most responsible for the fact that nuclear weapons have not been used in war since. Everyone was taught this book in school, including future lawmakers and future presidents. So, of course, I want to recommend that. It's 100 pages long. It's not going to take you long to read. There were plenty of people. It came out as one whole issue of The New Yorker when it originally appeared, and there were plenty of people who sat down and read that whole issue in one sitting. And supper can wait. And it's that kind of a book. I still strongly recommend it. But in terms of a later and larger historical overview, there is a book I want to recommend. It's a book called Hiroshima and Nagasaki by Paul Hamm. There are lots of other books that I could recommend on the subject, lots of them, including a great one called Thermonuclear Monarchies. But Paul Hamm's book is wonderfully comprehensive. So this is the reason I'm hesitating is because in addition to all of its other peaks and valleys, World War II also had several instances of the unthinkable. No one prior to D-Day had ever imagined a combined, successful, coordinated amphibious operation of its size. No one had ever imagined it. No one had ever really imagined anything on the scale of the Holocaust. And no one had ever really imagined science fiction weapons used in ordinary, everyday combat. Atomic bombs detonated over cities full of people. So that's another thing that you're going to contend with when you're reading about the subject. So, of course, if we're at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then we're at the end of the war because it caused the almost immediate surrender of Japan, and everything else was done by then as well. So that brings us to the end of the signposts. And then the last of the 10 items that I want to recommend here for this starter kit, another thing that you really need to do with World War II is read biographies of the key men involved. Unfortunately, because that in a couple of cases that is extremely unsavory reading. But nevertheless, I couldn't leave it off the list of key signposts. And that means 4 biographies, 4 men. Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Adolf Hitler. And I have recommendations for all of those. For Churchill, it's by William Manchester. It's one volume in his multi-volume life of Winston Churchill. The volume called Defender of the Realm is about Churchill during the war, and it's really good reading. And you don't need to read the other volumes to read it. So it gets my recommendation for that. For Stalin, he also has had many, many volumes, and Stephen Kotkin's ongoing biography of him is exhaustive, but truly impressive. But it hasn't really reached the time that we're talking about, and really you need the whole of the story of Stalin, or not just World War II. So I would suggest Edvard Radzinsky's biography of Stalin. He did a 1-volume biography about 20 years ago that's really good, very disturbing reading, but really good. For Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I'm going to recommend Robert Dallek's book. Robert Dallek just recently wrote a 1-volume biography that is just about as good as any 1-volume biography of FDR that I've ever read. So it gets my strong recommendation. And Hitler, Hitler also has had an endless stream of biography. He has a new one coming out in the autumn. But I want to recommend Ian Kershaw. Ian Kershaw did a 2-volume biography of Hitler. And the second volume of those, called Nemesis, covers 1936 to 1945 and is absorbing to read. Absorbing to read. And that's it. That is a World War II starter kit. The only extra category that I want to give you is those 1-volume overviews that I mentioned, that can often be very good to help you figure out the specific details, the specific thing that you want to concentrate on when it comes to the war. And I have 3 of those that I want to recommend, all from living historians, all currently in your bookstores, and all quite good. The first one is Inferno by Max Hastings. The second is The Storm of War by Andrew Roberts. And the third one is The Second World War by Anthony Beaver. All 3 of these are working historians. All 3 of them often do World War II. And all 3 of them did, in roughly the same 5-year period, 1-volume histories of the war that read differently, complementarily, interestingly. They contrast interestingly. And if that's your approach that you feel most comfortable with, a 1-volume history, then that's the one, those 3 I would recommend. Find those 3 in your library, take all 3 of them to a table, read the first chapter of each one of the 3 to figure out who is telling the story you want to hear, and then read that one first. So that is, after a long delay, that is my World War II starter kit. An enormous subject, far too big for a starter kit, but these are at least places to start, to get a handle on this incredible thing, this incredible story. So I'm gonna wrap this up for now, and sorry for the length, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.